The courtroom in the United States carried a kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. It was the type of quiet that pressed against the chest, the kind that made people sit straighter in their seats and think carefully before breathing too loudly. Wooden benches stretched in orderly rows, polished but worn from decades of restless hands and anxious shifting. High above, the ceiling lights hummed faintly, casting a pale glow over faces etched with worry, anticipation, and fatigue. At the front of the room, the judge's bench stood elevated, a symbol of authority and finality. Papers were neatly stacked, legal pads aligned, and microphones adjusted with practiced precision. Lawyers sat at their tables, flipping through documents they had reviewed countless times, yet still scanning them as if one missed detail could change everything. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, restrained by the unspoken understanding that this was a place where lives could pivot in a single sentence. Near the aisle, a uniformed police officer sat upright, his posture rigid but calm. Beside him lay his K-9 partner, a large, muscular dog trained for focus, obedience, and control. The dog's coat was immaculate, his ears alert even while resting. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed relaxed, but those who knew police dogs understood that even at rest, they were working. His eyes followed subtle movements, his body ready to respond if commanded. The dog's handler occasionally glanced down at him, not out of concern but habit. Years of working together had built a bond rooted in trust and discipline. This dog had searched dark buildings, tracked suspects through rain-soaked streets, and stood firm in chaotic situations. Courtrooms, though quieter, were no less important. His presence alone carried weight, a reminder of the investigation that had led everyone here. Several rows back sat a small girl, barely 3 years old. Her feet didn't touch the floor when she sat on the bench, instead swinging slightly as she leaned against her guardian. Her shoes were scuffed from play, her dress wrinkled in a way only children's clothes ever were. She didn't fidget the way adults expected children to in serious places. Instead, she looked around with open curiosity, her wide eyes absorbing every detail without judgment or fear. She didn't understand why everyone seemed tense. She didn't know what words like testimony, evidence, or verdict meant. To her, the courtroom was simply a big room filled with people who looked tired and serious. She noticed the echo when someone coughed. She noticed how voices sounded different when they spoke softly, and most of all, she noticed the dog. Her gaze lingered on him longer than anything else in the room. While adults saw a police K-9, a symbol of authority and enforcement, the child saw something else entirely. She saw a creature breathing steadily, lying patiently, existing calmly in a place where humans seemed anything but calm. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that felt soothing even from a distance. His eyes, dark and watchful, held no anger, only quiet awareness. The guardian beside her noticed the direction of the girl's attention and gently placed a hand on her knee, a subtle reminder to stay still. This was not the place for wandering or questions. The guardian's jaw was tight, shoulders tense, eyes fixed forward. They understood the seriousness of the day, the weight of what might be decided within these walls. The girl, however, felt none of that weight. She leaned slightly forward, craning her neck just enough to keep the dog in view. When the dog shifted his position, adjusting his paws beneath him, her lips parted in silent fascination. She didn't smile widely or point. She simply watched, absorbing him into her small world as something familiar and comforting. Up front, the judge entered and everyone rose in unison. The sound of benches scraping softly against the floor echoed through the room. The girl stood too, a moment slower than the adults, following their lead without understanding why. When everyone sat again, she mirrored the movement, her feet swinging once more above the floor. The proceedings began with formal words and structured routines. Names were called, documents were referenced. Voices remained controlled, professional, and detached. The police dog remained still, his presence steady, grounding the officer beside him. To many, he was just part of the process, another piece of the system at work. But the child continued to watch him, her attention unwavering. At one point, the dog's ears twitched, responding to a distant sound in the hallway. His tail shifted slightly against the floor, producing a faint thump that only those nearby noticed. The girl noticed it too. Her eyes widened just a little, as if she had discovered a secret detail no one else cared about. The handler felt it then, a subtle awareness that the dog was being observed in a different way, not scrutinized, not evaluated, simply seen. He glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting the child's for a split second before he looked away again. There was no fear in her expression, no hesitation, just interest, pure and uncomplicated. The air in the courtroom remained tense, but something fragile and unseen had begun to form beneath the surface. Like the first crack in ice before it breaks, there was a sense, unrecognized by most, that the emotional balance of the room was shifting, even if no one could explain why. The judge continued speaking. Lawyers continued listening. Pens scratched quietly against paper. Yet the story unfolding in the room was no longer only about the case before the court. It was also about the contrast between innocence and authority, between a child who knew nothing of rules and a dog who lived by them completely. No one yet realized that this ordinary morning, scheduled like any other, would soon be remembered not for the arguments made or decisions reached, but for a moment so simple, so unexpected, that it would linger in memory long after the courtroom emptied and the doors closed. And at the center of that moment sat a 3-year-old girl, swinging her feet, quietly watching a police dog, completely unaware that her curiosity was about to change the entire room. As the courtroom settled into its routine, the quiet returned, thick, controlled, and deliberate. The judge's voice moved steadily through formal language, and the lawyers listened with practiced expressions that revealed little. From the outside, everything appeared exactly as it should in a courtroom in the United States, orderly, disciplined, and emotionally restrained. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle was unfolding, something almost invisible. The police dog remained beside his handler, posture relaxed but alert. His training had taught him to read rooms the way humans read faces. He sensed tension in posture, changes in breathing, the sharp edge of anxiety that clung to certain voices. Courtrooms carried their own unique emotional signature, less chaotic than the streets, but heavy with unspoken consequences. He had been in rooms like this before and understood that stillness was expected. Still, his attention kept drifting, almost against his will. Across the aisle he could feel it, a steady, unguarded presence. Unlike the others whose emotions surged and receded, this presence remained light, curious, and calm. It didn't demand anything from him. It didn't assess him or fear him. It simply existed. The dog shifted his head slightly, just enough to bring the source into his peripheral vision. The small girl sat quietly, her legs swinging in a slow, uneven rhythm. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers loosely curled. She wasn't whispering, fidgeting, or tugging at the adult beside her. She was watching him the way children watch the world, with full attention and no assumptions. He met her gaze briefly. In that instant, something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not excitement, not alertness, something softer. Her eyes didn't carry expectation or hesitation. There was no tension in her body language, no stiffness in her shoulders. She wasn't calculating how he might react. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was simply observing, open and unafraid. The handler noticed the dog's subtle movement and tightened his grip on the leash just slightly. It was instinctive, a reflex shaped by years of responsibility. He followed the dog's line of sight and saw the child. His stomach tightened. Children were unpredictable, and courtrooms demanded control. He adjusted his posture, signaling silent readiness, though the dog hadn't broken discipline. The child, unaware of the silent exchange, tilted her head a little. From her perspective, the dog seemed calm, almost gentle. She noticed how his chest rose and fell. She noticed how still he could be, even when the room felt restless. To her, he didn't look dangerous or intimidating. He looked patient. The guardian beside her shifted slightly, adjusting their seat. Their eyes flicked toward the dog and then back to the front. They hadn't noticed how focused the child had become. Their mind was elsewhere, on the case, the implications, the uncertainty of what would follow this day. The courtroom atmosphere remained unchanged on the surface. Words flowed, time passed, but the connection, quiet, unspoken, continued to grow. The dog's ears twitched again, reacting not to sound but to presence. The child smiled faintly, not a broad grin, but the kind of smile that appears without conscious thought. It was a smile of recognition, as if she had decided that he was something familiar, something safe. The dog didn't wag his tail, he didn't move closer, but his breathing slowed, deepened. His body language softened in a way only someone deeply familiar with canine behavior would notice. The handler felt it through the leash, not movement but a shift in energy. He frowned slightly, confused. The dog was calm, but differently calm. For the first time since entering the courtroom, the handler allowed himself a brief glance backward. The child met his eyes for a second, then looked back at the dog. There was no mischief in her expression, no intention to disrupt, just interest. The handler exhaled slowly through his nose and faced forward again. Still, unease lingered. Not fear, something else. A sense that control was being shared with a moment he couldn't fully manage. The dog lay his head down on his paws, still facing forward but aware of her. He could smell her, clean, faintly sweet, with no sharp edges of stress. Children carried a different emotional scent than adults. It wasn't something he could name, but it was something he recognized instinctively. Minutes passed. The judge paused to review a document. The silence deepened. In that pause, the child shifted on the bench. Her feet stopped swinging. She leaned forward just a little, as if pulled by curiosity stronger than instruction. Her guardian felt the movement and gently placed a hand on her back, a silent reminder to sit still. She obeyed, but her eyes never left the dog. The dog lifted his head slightly again, their gazes aligning once more. This time, the moment lasted longer, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to register. Something inside the dog responded, not as a trained officer but as a living being. He didn't understand why the small human made him feel this way. He only knew that she brought no threat, no command, no expectation, just presence. Around them, adults shifted uncomfortably, unaware that the emotional center of the room had quietly relocated. It was no longer the judge's bench or the lawyer's tables. It was the invisible space between a child and a dog, where fear did not exist. The handler felt it again through the leash, a calm steadiness deeper than obedience. He swallowed, unsettled in a way he hadn't experienced in years of service. His dog had faced chaos without hesitation. Yet this moment, this quiet attention, had reached him in a different way. The guardian leaned down and whispered something to the child, likely a reminder about behaving properly. The girl nodded, her expression serious, as though she understood the importance of listening. She sat back, hands folded again, posture still. But the connection didn't break. It hovered in the air, gentle and patient, waiting. No one yet realized that this quiet exchange, the prolonged gaze, the shared calm, was the prelude, the spark before the moment, the subtle alignment that made what came next not reckless but inevitable. Because when innocence recognizes gentleness, and gentleness recognizes innocence, the result is never ordinary. And the courtroom, for all its rules and order, was about to witness something no training, protocol, or experience could fully prepare it for. The courtroom remained tense, but beneath the controlled exterior, the air carried a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered quietly to colleagues, and straightened ties or skirts, trying to maintain their composure. The judge, unaware of the invisible shift, spoke methodically, reviewing procedures and setting expectations. Officers sat at attention, the police dog calmly beside his handler, maintaining his trained posture. Yet, something extraordinary was quietly unfolding that no adult could fully perceive. The 3-year-old girl had been sitting quietly, observing, her gaze fixed on the police dog with unwavering focus. She had watched his chest rise and fall with measured breaths, the soft twitch of his ears at distant sounds, and the faint thump of his tail against the floor. To her, he was not a trained officer or an intimidating presence. He was simply there, calm and unthreatening. Her young mind interpreted him as a companion, a presence to be acknowledged, perhaps even approached. Curiosity began to pull her forward. She shifted slightly on the bench, testing the boundaries of the familiar adult world she did not fully understand. Her guardian adjusted her in her seat, leaning down to whisper a reminder about staying put. She nodded obediently, yet her eyes never left the dog. Something inside her tugged at her small hands and feet, urging movement. She was drawn not by mischief or defiance, but by fascination and instinct. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, she lifted one foot and then the other to the floor. She began to move toward the aisle, her steps small and careful. The rhythmic sound of her shoes on the polished floor barely registered to most adults, masked by murmured notes and the soft scratching of pens. But to the police dog, whose senses were finely tuned, the shift was noticeable. He lifted his head slightly, ears alert, tail still but attentive. The handler felt the subtle tug on his awareness. He glanced down and saw the girl taking tentative steps toward them. His body tensed instantly. Not now, his mind screamed. Courtrooms were unpredictable enough without a small child wandering near a working K-9. The leash felt heavier in his hand, a tangible reminder of responsibility. Yet even as he prepared to intervene, the dog remained seated calm, his eyes fixed not on the child as a threat, but as something different. The guardian noticed the movement too, their eyes widening. "No, sweetheart, stay here," they whispered sharply, half in warning and half in panic. But the child didn't waver. Her focus was singular, her steps deliberate yet gentle. She had decided on a path, guided by curiosity and an instinctive trust she didn't yet know how to name. The courtroom began to notice slowly. A few officers shifted uneasily in their seats. A clerk glanced up from her papers, puzzled. Lawyers exchanged nervous glances. The judge paused mid-sentence, pen hovering above paper. Something unusual was happening in the room, a disruption subtle in motion but powerful in implication. The girl reached the aisle, small hands gripping the edge of the bench briefly for balance. The polished wooden floor reflected the overhead lights, and her tiny shoes made soft sounds with each step. She moved with the natural confidence of a child who sees the world differently from adults, unburdened by rules, procedures, or fear. She was drawn forward by something that couldn't be measured or explained, a bond forming in real time, a silent connection across species and age. The police dog watched every movement with attentive calm. He sensed no threat, no challenge, no aggression. His body language softened subtly, a shift imperceptible to most but clear to those trained to read him. His head lifted slightly, his muzzle just above the floor and his eyes locked with hers. There was no command in her gaze, no expectation, only curiosity and the pure instinctive recognition of kindness. The handler's chest tightened. Years of experience had taught him to anticipate chaos, to react instantly to potential danger. Children could be unpredictable, and police dogs were trained to respond to commands, not impulses. Yet the dog remained still, unmoving except for the faint acknowledgement of her approach. The handler couldn't explain it. He couldn't call it obedience or discipline. It was something else entirely, awareness, acceptance, and trust, not commanded but earned silently. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the child continued her approach. The judge cleared his throat but didn't move. The lawyers froze, unsure if they should intervene or wait. A few spectators shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The atmosphere, once tense and rigid, was now suspended in an extraordinary moment of anticipation. Every adult realized, without fully understanding, that this was no ordinary day in court. The child stopped a few feet from the police dog. Her hands reached out slightly, hesitant but determined. Her wide eyes locked onto his, unafraid, unjudging. She tilted her head as though reading his thoughts, trying to communicate in a language older and simpler than words. She did not touch him yet. She simply extended her presence, a gesture of acknowledgement and recognition. The dog responded in kind. He lifted his head fully, ears forward, tail still but relaxed. He leaned slightly toward her, sensing the innocence and purity of her intent. There was no aggression, no fear, no sudden movement, only awareness and calm recognition. The handler's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of awe and unease. He had trained this dog for high-risk situations, for obedience under extreme stress. Nothing had prepared him for this silent exchange between child and canine. The guardian, realizing their daughter had almost reached the dog, leaned forward, hand outstretched. "Sweetheart, come back," they urged softly, though with less conviction than before. It was as if they too were caught in the moment, understanding in some subconscious way that this encounter was unfolding exactly as it needed to. The child paused, glanced briefly at her guardian, then returned her attention to the dog. Her hand moved a fraction forward, just enough to touch the edge of his fur. The dog's eyes softened further. He lowered his head slightly, meeting her gesture with patience and gentle acknowledgement. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Adults, used to control and procedure, felt powerless in the presence of such innocence and calm. In that brief moment, the dynamics of the courtroom shifted. Authority, tension, and expectation were still present, but they were layered over something unspoken and powerful. The recognition that kindness, curiosity, and trust could transcend fear, discipline, and hierarchy. The dog and child communicated a truth the adults had almost forgotten, that empathy and gentleness existed even in the most structured environments. Every pair of eyes in the room noticed. Some spectators blinked, unsure if they were imagining the soft exchange. Officers straightened, sensing the importance of the moment even if they couldn't articulate it. Lawyers froze mid-sentence, pens hovering above paper. The judge paused, reading the moment with silent acknowledgement, realizing that the day had shifted in significance beyond any legal argument. The little girl's next step was deliberate. She extended her small hand fully toward the dog's head. The police dog remained still, calm, and patient. The connection that had built in quiet increments was about to reach its climax, a moment where innocence would meet discipline, where empathy would meet training, and where the entire courtroom would witness something unforgettable. No one yet realized the emotional impact this tiny step would carry. The child's curiosity was about to transform a room filled with rules, stress, and responsibility into a space of shared human understanding. The police dog, trained for obedience and authority, had already begun responding in a way that no command could dictate, preparing for the extraordinary moment about to unfold. The room held its collective breath. Every adult was caught between routine and wonder. Every law, procedure, and expectation seemed to pause. And at the center of it all, a tiny 3-year-old girl took the step that would change everything. The 3-year-old girl stopped just a few feet from the police dog, her tiny hand hovering uncertainly above his broad head. She had been watching him for minutes that felt like hours, absorbing every movement, every shift in his posture, every subtle signal of calm authority that belied his strength. The courtroom had fallen into a strange silence, as if the collective attention of every adult present had focused on the child and the dog alone. Lawyers paused mid-gesture, spectators leaned forward in curiosity, and even the judge seemed momentarily unsettled by the unusual scene. The police dog, trained for obedience, protection, and acute alertness, remained still. His body language was controlled, disciplined, yet subtly softened. Ears pricked forward, tail still but relaxed, eyes attentive but gentle. He had faced danger, chaos, and threats that would make any human flinch, but this small human presented no threat, only a gesture born of innocence and instinct. He sensed it. The handler standing beside him was tense, ready to react, yet also mesmerized by the calm patience emanating from his partner. The girl, unaware of the tension around her, slowly extended her hand. Her fingers touched the dog's fur with a delicate, tentative pressure. She whispered something under her breath, soft syllables that no one else could hear. The dog leaned slightly into her touch, a gentle shift of weight that reflected trust, patience, and recognition. The room seemed to exhale in unison. Adults who had been rigid with expectation relaxed minutely, but the transformation was deeper than posture. It was emotional. For a brief, fragile moment, authority met innocence, and the contrast created an almost tangible energy. The judge cleared his throat softly, but made no move to intervene. Even the most rigid officers felt the moment stretching beyond protocol. The child's guardian reached forward, unsure whether to pull her back, yet unable to break the delicate balance of what was unfolding. It was a silent acknowledgement that sometimes life's most important moments are guided not by rules, but by intuition and heart. The dog's handler exhaled quietly, a hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulders, sensing the significance of the interaction. Years of training had prepared them for obedience, for danger, for structured responses, but nothing had prepared them for this. Here, the dog responded not to commands but to empathy. The girl's touch carried no expectation of performance, only the pure, simple language of kindness, and the dog understood. Whispers began to ripple quietly through the courtroom. Some spectators were openly moved, hands pressed to mouths or eyes, while others leaned closer to catch every subtle movement. The lawyer on the plaintiff's side paused in mid-sentence, pen hovering above paper, not wanting to disturb the fragile, charged silence. The courtroom, once heavy with stress and procedure, now existed in a strange liminal space where awe and wonder overpowered tension. The girl continued her gentle interaction. She brushed her small fingers lightly across the dog's fur, as though trying to communicate that she understood him, that she recognized his strength but also his gentleness. The dog remained steady, leaning into the touch, eyes half closed in quiet acknowledgement. There was no barking, no sudden movement, no reaction driven by training. There was only calm, deliberate understanding. Time seemed to dilate. What would have been seconds in the outside world felt like an eternity in the courtroom. Adults found themselves forgetting the proceedings, forgetting the rules, even forgetting the weight of the case before them. Their attention was fully captured by this simple exchange. It was rare, almost sacred, an authentic moment of trust that transcended human expectations and the rigid discipline of a trained working dog. The handler glanced down at the child, his eyes softening. "Steady," he whispered to the dog, more as affirmation than command. The dog responded not to his words but to the energy in the room, the trust in the child's gestures. The guardian finally relaxed their grip, realizing that the child was not acting recklessly. She was acting instinctively, guided by a natural understanding of the dog's temperament. As the girl's hand lingered, she gently patted the dog's head, the motion slow and deliberate. The dog shifted slightly, laying his head against her palm ever so lightly. The court remained silent except for the faint scratching of pens and a few suppressed breaths. There was a collective acknowledgement among all present. This was extraordinary. A moment so simple, yet so profoundly moving, that it would linger far longer than the outcome of any case heard that day. Even the spectators who had arrived expecting a routine hearing felt their hearts open. The harsh lines of law and judgment blurred for a moment. In that interaction between child and dog, there was a universal language that everyone recognized: trust, empathy, and the pure innocence of connection. The courtroom, filled with adults conditioned to expect tension, confrontation, and caution, was reminded of something they often forgot. Vulnerability and courage can coexist, and they can transform even the most rigid environments. The child, noticing the dog leaning slightly into her touch, smiled softly. It was the kind of smile that requires no words, no explanation, pure recognition. The dog responded in kind, shifting his massive body closer, calm and protective. The handler's chest tightened with emotion. This was not simply an act of obedience. It was a silent agreement, a shared understanding between two beings who communicated without language. The judge cleared his throat again, breaking the silence, but his voice carried a gentleness previously absent. Even he seemed affected, the weight of authority softened by the innocence and bravery displayed. The lawyers, officers, and spectators all adjusted, finding themselves both awed and humbled. The room that had begun the morning heavy with stress and anticipation now vibrated with something intangible: connection, empathy, and the subtle power of a single gesture. The girl finally withdrew her hand slowly, leaving the dog with a calm, expectant gaze. She returned to her seat, swinging her small feet once more, content in the knowledge that she had acknowledged and been acknowledged. The dog lay back down, alert but composed, his head gently resting on his paws. The handler exhaled, a mixture of relief, admiration, and awe passing through him. And in that courtroom, everyone present, lawyers, judge, officers, and spectators, realized that while the day had been scheduled for procedures, evidence, and testimony, the moment they had just witnessed transcended all of that. A small child's courage and innocence had communicated something profound. Even in spaces dominated by rules, discipline, and authority, gentleness and trust could shine through. That simple gesture, an outstretched hand, a soft touch, a recognition of another being, had shifted the emotional center of the room. Adults were no longer simply participants in a legal process. They were witnesses to something rare, something that reminded them of the essential humanity beneath uniforms, procedures, and decorum. It was a reminder that power and authority were strongest when tempered with compassion, that obedience could coexist with empathy, and that courage did not always roar. It sometimes whispered in a child's soft gesture toward a faithful dog trained to serve and protect. No one in the courtroom could have predicted the ripple effect of what had occurred. A single, simple touch had changed the energy, the tone, and the mood, opening hearts in ways that legal arguments never could. The stage was set for something even more extraordinary, the moment when the dog would fully respond, not just to instinct or training, but to a bond formed in that suspended space of trust, innocence, and recognition. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, collectively aware that the extraordinary had already begun. And from the corner of the bench, the 3-year-old girl sat back, small but resolute, unaware that her simple gesture had not only touched the dog but had shifted the entire courtroom in ways no one would forget. The courtroom remained still, the air thick with anticipation, as if even the walls were leaning closer to witness what was unfolding. The 3-year-old girl had returned to her seat, her small hands folded in her lap, swinging her feet just slightly above the floor. But the police dog, trained for obedience, alertness, and protective action, remained attuned to her presence. His massive head rested lightly on his paws, but his eyes never left her. Every muscle in his body, trained to respond instantly to danger, now registered only calm awareness. The dog's handler exhaled quietly, a mix of relief and disbelief passing through him. He had spent years working with this partner, training him for situations that were high-risk, unpredictable, and sometimes life-threatening. The dog had chased suspects, apprehended criminals, and tracked missing people through forests and city streets. He had faced chaos without hesitation, responding with speed, strength, and precision. Yet this was different. This was not chaos, nor threat, nor command. This was trust, the quiet, unspoken kind, and it had emerged from a 3-year-old girl. The dog shifted slightly, leaning his shoulder toward the child's direction, his eyes softening further. Every instinct told him that he could retreat, remain passive, or act only if necessary. But instead, he remained grounded, connected to the moment, acknowledging the purity of the child's gesture. The handler noticed the subtle change immediately. It was not obedience in the way he knew, not the result of command, but a recognition, an emotional understanding that transcended training. The courtroom collectively sensed the shift, even if no one could articulate it. Lawyers froze in mid-motion, pens poised above paper. The judge's hands hovered over the bench, a gentle pause breaking the rhythm of legal procedure. Officers adjusted their stance, feeling a tension that was no longer rigid authority but awe. Spectators leaned forward, whispering softly, uncertain if what they were witnessing was allowed in words or even comprehension. The child's gaze returned to the dog. Her lips moved in the faintest whisper, though no one could hear her words. She extended a tiny hand again, this time with more intention, reaching out toward the dog's head. The dog, massive yet gentle, leaned in slightly, resting his cheek against her touch. It was a gesture so simple, yet it carried the weight of something profound. Acknowledgement, empathy, and connection that transcended species, age, and social constructs. The handler's eyes glistened. He had trained this dog to follow commands, to protect, to act decisively in the presence of danger. But no training had prepared him for this quiet emotional exchange. The dog responded not to authority but to presence, not to commands but to authenticity. In that instant, the massive animal, a creature of power and discipline, became a mirror of innocence and gentleness. The courtroom's energy shifted almost imperceptibly at first, then more visibly. A few spectators exhaled quietly. Some clasped their hands together, instinctively aware of witnessing something rare. The judge's stern features softened and he leaned back in his chair. The lawyers, even those focused on strategy, could not ignore the profound silence that now held the room captive. The tension had transformed, not dissolved, but redirected toward awe and reflection. The child patted the dog again, her fingers brushing along the soft fur of his head. The dog's tail gave a faint wag, subtle enough to go unnoticed by many, but unmistakable to those paying close attention. It was a slow, deliberate acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you. I recognize your courage and your innocence." The handler lowered his hand slightly, not needing to intervene, because the dog's calm presence spoke louder than any command could. A ripple of emotion spread quietly among the adults. Officers felt it first, recognizing the significance of the moment. They had seen danger, fear, and heroism, but nothing like this, nothing so gentle and so commanding in its quiet power. Then the spectators began to feel it. The lawyer's assistant, taking notes for record-keeping, blinked back tears. Even the judge's clerk adjusted her posture, acknowledging internally the profoundness of what had just occurred. The child, unaware of the gravity of her actions, smiled faintly. She had done nothing extraordinary in her mind, just reached out, just touched, just acknowledged. Yet in doing so, she had bridged a gap between authority and innocence, between discipline and empathy, between human and animal. The dog, massive and trained to respond to chaos, had chosen connection over instinct, trust over command. In that moment, the courtroom ceased to be just a space of law. It became a stage for a silent lesson in humanity. Every individual present felt it differently, yet no one could deny it. The law, the procedures, the rules, they all continued, but they were framed now within a context of compassion and understanding. Adults who had come expecting conflict and argument found themselves reflecting on something far more essential: the quiet power of empathy and courage, expressed in its purest form by a child and a dog. The dog's head rested against the child's hand for several more seconds, each one stretching into eternity for those paying attention. The child whispered once more, too softly for anyone to hear, and the dog leaned slightly, closing his eyes for a brief instant in trust. The room felt almost sacred in that suspended moment, as though all the weight of tension had lifted, replaced with something profoundly human. The guardian finally leaned down and whispered, "Honey, sit back now." But their voice carried no urgency, only gentle encouragement. The child obeyed slowly, returning to her seat, feet swinging lightly, her eyes still shining from the interaction. The dog, still patient, lowered his head fully, resting on his paws, yet his gaze remained soft, aware, and protective. The courtroom slowly exhaled collectively, the tension of anticipation giving way to quiet reflection. Adults blinked, unsure whether to return fully to procedure or simply sit in wonder. The judge cleared his throat and resumed speaking, but his voice was softer, almost reverent. The lawyers, officers, and spectators carried a subtle awareness of what had transpired, a single moment that had transcended law, authority, and structure. The child's simple gesture had shifted the center of attention and emotion in the room. Authority and discipline had not been undermined, they had been humanized. The dog's response had softened hearts hardened by years of procedure and expectation. The courtroom now operated on two planes: the visible legal process and the invisible, enduring lesson of trust, innocence, and courage. It was clear to everyone that day. The small child had changed the atmosphere completely. A simple gesture, a gentle touch, a moment of recognition between an innocent human and a faithful dog. These had combined to create something far more powerful than argument, evidence, or testimony. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It was a place of understanding, witness, and empathy. Even after the session resumed, the ripple of that gesture lingered. Eyes glanced toward the dog and the child intermittently, unconsciously recalling the profound connection. Conversation, when it happened quietly in the hallways afterward, revolved around the moment of interaction rather than the proceedings themselves. Every participant carried it with them, a memory that would endure long after the gavel fell and the case concluded. The child had returned to her seat, and the dog had lowered his head, but the bond formed in that brief interaction had irrevocably altered the room. Hearts were softened, perspectives shifted, and the reminder of compassion amid structure had left an indelible impression. No one present would forget how a tiny hand had reached out, and how a massive, trained police dog had responded, not with instinct or training, but with recognition, patience, and trust. The courtroom, now transformed in tone, continued with its proceedings, but the moment had already achieved its lasting effect. The dog, once simply a participant in the legal process, had become a symbol of gentleness and courage. The child, unaware of her influence, had sparked an emotional awakening in a room dominated by authority and expectation. Together, they had created a moment that would resonate far longer than any ruling, testimony, or legal argument could. And so, as the day continued, the courtroom operated on two levels, the procedural and the profound. One was visible, measured, and predictable. The other was invisible, emotional, and enduring. The dog and the child had forged a connection that would not fade with time, a reminder that empathy, innocence, and trust could transform even the most rigid and tense environments. No one in the room had expected this. No one could have anticipated it. And yet, it had happened. A 3-year-old girl's gentle gesture had unlocked a response from a police dog that transcended training and expectation. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet, undeniable power of connection. The courtroom had returned to its official rhythm after the extraordinary moment, but the emotional landscape had been irreversibly altered. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, witnesses answered carefully, and the judge's gavel still marked the flow of procedure. Yet beneath the rigid formality, something remarkable lingered, a quiet reverence that no one had anticipated. The 3-year-old girl, having returned to her seat, swung her small feet gently and watched the dog with wide, innocent eyes. She had no idea that her simple touch had shifted the energy of the entire room. The police dog remained at the front of the courtroom, his massive head resting on his paws, yet every so often he glanced at the child, a soft acknowledgement in his eyes. He had fulfilled his role countless times in high-stakes situations, chasing, tracking, guarding, but never had he participated in an exchange so subtle and profound. The handler, standing beside him, could feel the residual warmth of the connection as a palpable force in the air. Every muscle in the dog's body was relaxed now, his discipline untouched but softened by the interaction. Whispers began to ripple through the courtroom, quiet enough not to disrupt the proceedings but loud enough for those paying attention to notice. Officers leaned slightly toward one another, exchanging small smiles and nods, understanding what had just happened without needing to voice it. Some spectators wiped their eyes discreetly, overwhelmed by the pure, unexpected humanity of the moment. Even the judge, who prided himself on impartiality and focus, paused in his thoughts, reflecting on the significance of what had occurred. The child's guardian leaned down and whispered softly, "Did you like the dog?" The girl nodded shyly, a faint smile forming on her lips. She was unaware that this small gesture had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the simple touch of fur. Adults were learning lessons they had forgotten long ago, that compassion could exist even in structured spaces, that trust could be formed in moments without words, and that courage came in forms both small and profound. The police dog shifted slightly, allowing his body to stretch without breaking the awareness he still held. The handler exhaled quietly, a hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. "Good boy," he murmured under his breath, not because the dog had obeyed a command, but because he had recognized and responded to a human connection. That acknowledgement, unspoken but deeply felt, marked a turning point for everyone observing. The dog had not only remained calm, he had actively chosen to engage with empathy, demonstrating the rare balance between strength and gentleness. Throughout the remainder of the morning, the courtroom's tone subtly changed. Testimonies continued, questions were asked, and legal arguments were made, but the invisible layer of tension had dissipated. Adults found themselves glancing toward the dog and the child occasionally, drawn by the memory of that quiet interaction. It was as if the room itself had absorbed the lesson of connection, its atmosphere softened by the reminder that vulnerability and trust could coexist with discipline and authority. Even the witnesses seemed different when they spoke. Their voices, though clear and precise, carried a hint of humanity that had previously been absent. Jurors, if present, shifted slightly in their chairs, subconsciously reflecting on the balance of power, empathy, and trust they had just witnessed. The courtroom's walls, once rigid and imposing, now felt almost protective, as though they had absorbed the emotional significance of the gesture and carried it silently alongside every decision made that day. After the morning session concluded, people began to rise from their seats, yet many moved more slowly than usual, reluctant to leave the aura of quiet reverence. Spectators lingered in small groups, whispering about the child and the dog, sharing their impressions of the extraordinary moment. Even the most hardened officers, accustomed to facing danger, reflected on how something as simple as a touch could alter perception and mood so completely. Outside the courtroom, conversations continued, carrying the story with them like a gentle current. Staff in the building recounted what they had seen, describing the child's courage and the dog's remarkable calm. The story spread quickly, not in official reports, but in quiet, heartfelt reflections shared among those who understood the rarity of what had just occurred. The police dog, usually viewed only as a working tool in serious matters, had demonstrated an emotional intelligence that inspired admiration. The handler knelt beside his partner as they exited the courtroom. He allowed the dog a moment of rest, running his hand over his fur gently. "You did good," he said softly, aware that the dog's actions had gone beyond training or protocol. The dog leaned into the touch, still alert but relaxed, his eyes reflecting the shared understanding they both now carried. In those brief seconds, the handler realized that the dog had taught a lesson to everyone present, a lesson in patience, trust, and the power of empathy. Meanwhile, the child's guardian reflected on the interaction as well. They marveled at how instinct, curiosity, and innocence could create such a profound effect. They realized that their daughter had not simply approached a dog. She had approached a living being with authenticity and courage, and the dog had met her halfway. That balance between vulnerability and strength, so rare in adults, had revealed itself perfectly in the courtroom that day. The emotional consequences extended beyond the immediate participants. People in the courtroom would remember that day for years, not the details of legal arguments, not the outcome of the case, but the quiet, powerful exchange between a child and a dog. It was a reminder that even in structured, procedural spaces, human connection remained paramount. The simple act of acknowledgement had transformed the environment, turning an ordinary courtroom into a place of reflection, humility, and shared humanity. As the day continued, the child quietly observed from her seat, swinging her feet gently, unaware of the lasting impression she had left. The dog, still at attention, occasionally glanced in her direction, a subtle reminder that the connection had not been fleeting. Every observer in the room, consciously or unconsciously, carried the memory with them, integrating the lesson of gentleness into a space traditionally defined by authority and procedure. The moment also left the adults reconsidering their roles. Judges, lawyers, officers, and spectators realized that authority and discipline did not need to dominate every interaction. Compassion, recognition, and empathy could coexist alongside duty, creating outcomes far more meaningful than rules alone could dictate. The child had demonstrated that even the smallest gestures could reverberate across an environment dominated by power and expectation. By the end of the day, as people exited the courtroom, a sense of quiet respect remained in the air. Conversations were hushed, reflections deep, and an unspoken acknowledgement persisted. Something extraordinary had occurred, and it would not be forgotten. The police dog, once simply a participant in legal proceedings, had become a symbol of emotional intelligence and gentleness. The 3-year-old girl, unaware of her influence, had sparked a transformative moment that changed the way everyone in the room perceived courage, trust, and empathy. Even hours later, when the courtroom was empty and the day's official business concluded, the memory lingered. Every participant carried it silently, knowing that the ordinary had been touched by the extraordinary. The consequences of a simple gesture, one small hand reaching out, one massive dog responding with patience, were far-reaching. Lives were affected, perspectives shifted, and a profound lesson had been quietly delivered. The courtroom had witnessed more than a legal proceeding. It had witnessed the embodiment of trust, innocence, and courage. It had been reminded that empathy and gentleness, even in spaces defined by discipline and rules, could transform environments, shift hearts, and inspire reflection. And all of this had been accomplished by a 3-year-old girl and a police dog, an unlikely pair whose quiet interaction left an enduring mark on everyone who witnessed it. The days following that extraordinary courtroom encounter were filled with quiet reflection for everyone involved. While the legal proceedings continued, the impact of the simple, powerful connection between the 3-year-old girl and the police dog lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Adults found themselves recalling the moment at unexpected times, a brief memory of a small hand touching a massive head, of eyes meeting in mutual recognition, of patience meeting innocence. The courtroom, once a place of tension and authority, had been subtly transformed. The child's guardian, after leaving the courtroom, reflected on what had happened. They were amazed that a child so young had demonstrated courage and intuition far beyond her years. They had been worried when she had taken steps toward the dog, anticipating potential danger or disruption, yet the outcome had been completely opposite. Instead of chaos, there had been connection. Instead of fear, there had been calm. And in that connection, something transformative had occurred, not only for the dog and the child, but for everyone present. The police dog, meanwhile, had returned to his routine duties, but he carried with him a new awareness. Trained to respond to commands, to remain disciplined in tense situations, he had now experienced a type of interaction that went beyond training. Genuine, unguarded trust. The handler noticed it immediately in the dog's demeanor. His partner was calmer, more patient, almost reflective, a subtle shift that wasn't visible to most but undeniable to someone who had spent years observing him. The bond formed in that courtroom was not fleeting. It had left a lasting impression on both dog and handler. A few days later, the child and her guardian were invited back to meet the dog in a controlled, safe environment. It was a small gesture from the police department, meant both as recognition and as a reward for the child's bravery and empathy. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw the dog again. She ran forward, not recklessly, but with the same deliberate, gentle steps she had taken in the courtroom. Her tiny hands reached out, and the dog responded immediately, lowering his head, tail wagging slightly and eyes soft with recognition. The handler watched from nearby, a small smile playing on his lips. He had trained the dog for countless high-stress scenarios, but none had carried the same emotional weight as this. Seeing the dog interact so calmly and openly with the child reinforced something he had always believed but rarely witnessed so clearly, that genuine connection could inspire behaviors far beyond training. The dog's patience, gentleness, and responsiveness were a testament to the power of trust and empathy. The child giggled softly as she stroked the dog's fur. Her small fingers moved carefully over his head and back, and the dog leaned into her touch, shifting slightly to allow her comfort. It was as though the courtroom moment had never ended, that the bond had carried forward seamlessly. The guardian watched silently, marveling at the simplicity and purity of the interaction. There were no words necessary. None could capture the depth of understanding between the child and the dog. Word of the courtroom moment had already spread throughout the police department and the local community. Officers shared the story in hushed tones, recounting the unusual but deeply meaningful exchange they had witnessed. Lawyers and courtroom staff reflected privately on the event, considering how a small act of courage and innocence could shift the energy of an entire room. Parents in the community who had heard about it discussed it with their children, emphasizing empathy, kindness, and courage. The child's bond with the dog grew over the weeks that followed. Each visit allowed them to explore their connection more fully. She learned to respect his personal space, understanding his cues and gestures. The dog, in turn, grew increasingly attuned to her emotions, responding to her mood, energy, and presence with patience and subtle communication. Together, they demonstrated the profound impact of trust, teaching those around them lessons in empathy, patience, and gentle courage. In the courtroom, the ripple effect continued. Officers, jurors, and courtroom staff frequently recalled the moment, bringing a subtle warmth to otherwise procedural days. Even during tense arguments or stressful testimonies, they would remember the child's courage and the dog's calm response. The memory served as a quiet reminder that empathy could exist even within rigid structures, and that trust, once earned, could transform both individuals and environments. The judge, who had observed the interaction firsthand, began to integrate this awareness into his courtroom demeanor. He spoke with slightly more warmth and patience, acknowledged the humanity of those before him, and allowed moments of natural reflection where appropriate. Lawyers, too, noticed the shift, becoming more attuned to the emotional undercurrents of their arguments. The courtroom, once defined strictly by rules and procedure, now held space for the acknowledgement of human connection and understanding. Community members who heard the story were inspired as well. Local media covered the event, highlighting not only the courtroom drama but the remarkable empathy displayed by a child and the responsiveness of a trained police dog. Teachers, parents, and civic leaders used it as a teaching moment, emphasizing the value of kindness, courage, and emotional intelligence. It was a reminder that profound lessons could emerge from the simplest acts. The child, unaware of her influence on the wider world, continued her visits to the dog. Each encounter reinforced mutual understanding and trust. The dog responded to her presence with gentle attentiveness, demonstrating the subtle intelligence and emotional awareness that had captivated the courtroom. Their bond became a quiet source of joy and stability, an example of how even small gestures could carry immense meaning. Through this growing bond, both the child and the dog learned from one another. She learned patience, observation, and empathy, while the dog reinforced his understanding of gentleness and the nuanced language of human emotions. Their interactions were natural, spontaneous, and authentic, a dynamic neither structured by rules nor constrained by expectation. They were simply present with one another, demonstrating the transformative power of trust and connection. By the end of this period, it was clear that the courtroom story was not just a fleeting moment but a lasting influence. The child had inspired change in multiple spheres, within the police department, in legal proceedings, and in the wider community. The dog had proven that strength and discipline could coexist with gentleness, patience, and empathy. And together, they had shown that courage was not always loud or confrontational. Sometimes, it was expressed in the quiet courage of a simple gesture. The impact of this bond would endure long after the courtroom was emptied, long after formal proceedings concluded, and long after official recognition had been given. It became a story retold for its emotional resonance, a tale of human-animal connection that reminded everyone of the capacity for trust, empathy, and courage to transform even the most structured environments. In quiet moments, The child's guardian would reflect on the simple truth that children see the world differently, that innocence can reveal what adults overlook, and that kindness can open hearts in ways that formal authority cannot. And the handler, watching the dog respond to the child with patience and understanding, realized that emotional intelligence was as critical as training, that gentleness could be as powerful as force, and that a single moment of trust could leave an enduring mark on all who witnessed it. The bond between the child and the dog became a symbol, not just of empathy and courage, but of possibility. It was proof that the smallest gestures, carried out with authenticity and innocence, could create ripples that extended far beyond their immediate context. It was a reminder that the world, even in its most structured or tense moments, could be transformed by connection, compassion, and trust. The story of that courtroom day continued to ripple outward long after the last gavel fell. The 3-year-old girl, her small hand once extended toward a massive police dog, had sparked an extraordinary moment that no one would forget. What began as a simple, instinctive gesture had transformed into something far more profound, a story of empathy, trust, and connection that transcended age, species, and circumstance. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom became a quieter, more reflective space. Lawyers, judges, and officers often recalled the child's courage and the dog's calm, gentle response as a touchstone of what empathy could accomplish. The judge, who had seen the event firsthand, began to incorporate small moments of patience and humanity into proceedings, recognizing that the law, though necessary, was most meaningful when tempered with compassion. Legal teams remarked on how much more attentive jurors and witnesses had become after witnessing the story unfold. Even a single quiet act had shifted the energy of the room permanently. The child herself continued her visits with the police dog under the supervision of her guardian. These visits were not staged or forced. They were organic, reflecting the natural bond that had been established. Each encounter deepened the mutual understanding between child and dog. She learned to respect his personal space and observe his cues, while he, in turn, reinforced gentle behavior and attentiveness, responding to her energy in subtle, meaningful ways. Their connection became a quiet sanctuary of trust and affection, far removed from the stress and formality of the courtroom. Community members, having heard the story through local media and word of mouth, were captivated. Parents spoke with their children about courage and empathy. Educators incorporated the story into lessons about kindness and understanding, and police officers used it as a teaching moment for recruits, emphasizing the importance of patience, compassion, and emotional intelligence in their line of work. The courtroom story became more than a fleeting news piece. It became a symbol, a lesson in the quiet but transformative power of human-animal connection. For the police dog, the interaction with the child reinforced a subtle but crucial aspect of his training. Beyond obedience and protection, he had now experienced the profound effect of empathy and trust. The handler noticed changes in his partner's behavior, calmer interactions with the public, a softer presence in routine patrols, and a subtle responsiveness to nonverbal cues. The dog had learned, in his own way, the value of patience and gentle attention, lessons imparted not by command, but by instinct and connection. The guardian marveled at their daughter's instinctive bravery. They realized that children, unburdened by preconceptions and fear, could perceive qualities in others that adults might miss entirely. The child had reached out not for recognition, nor for reward, but simply because her heart told her to do so. That act of authenticity had illuminated the power of empathy in its purest form, and in doing so, it had taught the adults around her a lesson they would carry forever. The courtroom itself seemed subtly changed. Officers and lawyers moved through the space with a sense of respect for the unexpected depth of human interaction. Even routine cases carried an undercurrent of mindfulness, a gentle reminder that the courtroom was more than just a place of law. It was a space where empathy, understanding, and courage could coexist with authority and procedure. The memory of the child and the dog became a quiet legend among courtroom staff, a story retold not for drama, but for its enduring emotional significance. Months later, the police department officially recognized the girl's bravery and the dog's calm response. They arranged a small ceremony in which the child could meet the dog again, in a setting that celebrated their connection. The event was simple, intimate, and heartfelt. Officers, staff, and community members gathered to honor the unlikely duo. The child, shy yet proud, reached out once more, and the dog responded immediately, resting his massive head gently in her hands. The room was filled not with speeches or pomp, but with quiet awe. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something rare, a pure moment of trust and recognition that transcended the ordinary. From that day on, the story of the child and the police dog became a symbol in the wider community. Local schools included it in lessons about courage, empathy, and human-animal bonds. Community centers displayed photographs of the duo, capturing the moment the child's hand touched the dog's head. Even in casual conversations, people would recount the story, marveling at how a 3-year-old girl and a trained police dog had together created a moment that reshaped the way adults thought about trust and gentleness. The long-term impact extended beyond the courtroom and community. Officers began to consider more deeply how empathy could influence their work, understanding that authority and discipline were most effective when balanced with patience and recognition. Children and adults alike were inspired to reach out in small ways, to act with kindness, to trust, and to recognize the potential for positive connection in even the most structured environments. The police dog and the child remained friends, their interactions continuing whenever possible. Each visit reinforced the lessons already learned, deepening the bond of mutual respect and trust. They became a living reminder that courage is not always loud, that strength can coexist with gentleness, and that empathy can transform not just individuals but entire communities. Years later, people who had witnessed the courtroom moment continued to recount the story. It was not remembered for its legal significance or procedural outcome, but for the extraordinary emotional resonance of a simple gesture. A 3-year-old girl had reached out, and a massive police dog had responded with calm patience. That small act had created ripples far beyond the room, touching lives in subtle, profound ways. Even in adult conversations long after the event, the story carried lessons. Trust and courage can manifest in unexpected forms. Empathy has a power that authority alone cannot replicate. And sometimes the simplest gestures, a hand extended, a touch given, can change everything. The courtroom had become a place where hearts were opened, even briefly, and the world beyond carried the memory forward, inspiring countless small acts of kindness. The legacy of that day endured because it was rooted in authenticity. The child had acted from instinct, curiosity, and courage, and the dog had responded with awareness, gentleness, and trust. Together, they created a moment that transcended expectation, reshaped perceptions, and reminded everyone who witnessed it that even in spaces defined by rules and structure, the human heart, and the heart of a loyal companion, could redefine what was possible. In the end, the story became more than a tale of courtroom drama. It became a testament to the quiet power of connection, the courage of innocence, and the extraordinary capacity of empathy to transform not just individual interactions, but entire environments. A simple gesture, carried out without thought of recognition, had changed the hearts of everyone present, and its legacy continued, inspiring all who heard it to act with kindness, trust, and courage in their own lives. And so, in that courtroom in the United States, long after the legal proceedings ended, the memory of a small hand resting on the head of a faithful police dog endured, echoing as a timeless reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can create ripples that transform the world.